How fortunate are we to live in a time where we don't have to fear gruesome punishments like mutilation, public burnings, suffocation, or countless other torturous methods for even the simplest actions. Human dignity is a right, but a right that slaves throughout history unfortunately did not possess. They were treated as property, subjected to unimaginable cruelty, and denied the most fundamental freedoms that we often take for granted today. We seek to expose those truths as we reveal the most disgusting, the most dehumanizing punishments inflicted upon black bodies during the era of slavery. Prepare to be horrified, prepare to be outraged, but most importantly, prepare to never forget. I must warn you though, the knowledge you're about to learn is quite disturbing, so please take caution. That said, here are 10 of the most disgusting punishments for blacks during slavery. Welcome to our channel if you are new here. Subscribe for untold history, diverse perspectives, and meaningful discussions. Join us to honor history, foster empathy, and shape a better world. Hit subscribe now. Number 1. Whipping and salting. In March of 1863, a man named Peter escaped from slavery on a Louisiana plantation. The journey was dangerous, but he eventually found safety among Union soldiers in Baton Rouge before joining a black regiment. Military doctors examined him, only to discover something extremely horrifying. His back was covered with severe and protruding scars, a result of continuous brutal whippings from his former overseer. Peter had been the legal property of Captain John Lyons of Street Landry Parish, Louisiana. It's even more disturbing when you consider that the slaveholder not only ran his plantation in what might seem like a place associated with purity and holiness, but also owned 38 slaves at that time. Who knows what else he did or permitted his slave overseers to do to all of them? In America, slaves, including pregnant women and children, were often whipped as punishment. The Street Louis Republican even reported an incident in which a slave owner had his 8-year-old female slave whipped to death in 1844. The actions of the owner went unpunished. However, some owners weren't even content with whipping. When their slaves' wounds began to heal, these owners ordered that the wounds be split open and that products such as red pepper and turpentine be applied to the gashes. According to some accounts, one owner even ground a brick into rubble and dust, mixed it with lard, and had it rubbed into the wounds of a slave. The pain was excruciating. A November 12, 1863 letter from a Bostonian discusses Peter's case, whose lacerated back in a photograph stirred widespread sympathy and outrage among humanitarian circles. Peter, speaking broken English and primarily French, recounted his escape and revealed horrific details of the abuse inflicted by overseer Arthion Carrier. Not only had Peter been violently whipped, but all of his wounds were also wiped with salt brine. This practice of whipping and salting wounds, along with other torturous methods like turpentine and hot pepper juice, was sadly common among enslaved individuals punished for various reasons deemed appropriate by their overseers or owners. Unfortunately, some slaves even got whipped when they did nothing wrong. To prevent any potential defiance, slave owners might whip their slaves before any offense was even committed. This was seen as a way to break their spirit and prevent future transgressions. Number 2. Mutilation. The mutilation of slaves was another cruel act often implemented under the guise of punishment or even allegedly done for the slave's personal well-being. However, historical records reveal that such acts were far more about brutality than rehabilitation. For instance, Captain Philip Eloy was known to break the teeth of female slaves deemed disobedient, demonstrating the horrific lengths to which slave owners would go to exert control. Mutilation was often an equally horrifying fate as death itself. During the Middle Passage, ship captains would resort to beheading recaptured slaves who attempted to escape, using their gruesome deaths as a warning to others. In the harsh conditions of sugar plantations, slaves who succumbed to exhaustion and fell asleep in the mill might have a limb cut off as an example to other slaves of the dangers of falling asleep on the job. But even those practices were not nearly as horrendous as other instances. Moses Roper, who had lived as a slave in the Carolinas and Georgia, recalls in his narrative that his master poured tar on his head and face and set him on fire before clamping the fingers of his hand in a vise, removing his fingernails, and having another man smash his toes with a sledgehammer. Roper survived to tell the tale, but not everyone was as lucky. Number 3. Tying and burning in hot grease. Born in 1813, Harriet Jacobs was frequently the victim of brutal violence from her master. Fortunately, she was able to escape slavery and wrote about her experiences in her book, Incidents in the Life of a Slave Girl. She tells of a slaveholder called Mr. Litch, a very wealthy man who had 600 slaves. Various forms of punishment were inflicted on those slaves, but according to Harriet, a common punishment employed was to tie a rope around the slave's body and suspend him from the ground. A fire was kindled beneath them with a piece of fat pork suspended above. As the pork cooked, scalding drops of fat continually fell on the bare flesh, causing continuous and extreme pain. Knowing that Mr. Litch had hundreds of slaves, who knows how many of them had to endure this awful torture. Number 5. The Virginia Play. Escaped slave William Wells Brown discussed a form of punishment he encountered in Virginia during slavery. Brown was hired out to Major Freeland, a violent and abusive man. Working in Major Freeland's household, which doubled as a public house, meant enduring constant threats and physical abuse. The Major's fits of anger often escalated to throwing chairs at his servants. However, the Major's preferred method of discipline involved tying them up and subjecting them to brutal whippings in a smokehouse. He would then create a fire from tobacco stems to suffocate and smoke the slaves as further punishment. He called this the Virginia Play. Despite Brown's complaints to his own master about Major Freeland's cruelty, no intervention was made as long as his master continued to receive money from his labor. Desperate to escape the relentless torment, Brown fled into the woods, but was swiftly tracked down by bloodhounds, captured, and returned to Major Freeland. He endured the very punishment he had witnessed time and time again during his stay at the Major's, severe whipping followed by the painful smoking ritual in the smokehouse. After what the Major considered to be sufficient smoking, Brown was untied and immediately set to work again. Number 6. Public burning. Throughout history, punishments inflicted on slaves were often public spectacles intended to instill fear and obedience in other enslaved individuals. These gruesome displays were even attended by neighboring townspeople as a form of entertainment. Among the most horrifying methods of punishment was public burning, where victims were either tied to a stake or hung above a fire. Some died from smoke inhalation before the flames reached them, while others suffered unimaginable burning agony until death finally provided release. One such instance is the tale of a slave named Jerry in 1830. Jerry was burned in an open field with thousands of spectators. The scene included a large pile of pitch pine logs and kindling, where he was chained to a stake. Despite the inhumane circumstances, Jerry reportedly prayed audibly as the flames consumed him. His execution became notorious as the last recorded instance of burning a slave in South Carolina. Why did Jerry get such a harsh punishment, you ask? Well, he was charged with abusing his subcontracted master's wife, which was considered a serious offense. While what he did was definitely wrong, it's important to note that if a white man had done the same thing, he would have gotten a much lighter sentence. And in cases where white men abused enslaved women, there often wasn't even a trial. Jerry's case, although legally justified at the time, highlights the unequal application of justice. A black man like Jerry faced the ultimate punishment for a crime that a white man would have gotten off much easier for. Number 4. Hog's Head. We go back to the account of Moses Roper, who suffered and witnessed many forms of cruel punishments. While enslaved, Moses Roper had many opportunities to witness the harsh treatment adopted by masters towards their slaves as he traveled through various slave states with his owner. After escaping slavery, Roper wrote a book detailing the torture and indignities endured by American slaves, including the sadistic pleasure some owners took in corporal punishment. According to Roper, there was a slaveholder named Colonel McQuiller who would hammer nails into a large barrel, typically known as a hogshead, leaving the nail points protruding inside. Slaves were then stuffed into these barrels and rolled down long, steep hills while the owner and other slaves watched. This torturous punishment killed 7 of McQuiller's slaves. Roper states that this form of punishment was first adopted by a man named Mr. Perry and was later adopted by several other slaveholders. Number 5. The Virginia Play. Escaped slave William Wells Brown discussed a form of punishment he encountered in Virginia during slavery. Brown was hired out to Major Freeland, a violent and abusive man. Working in Major Freeland's household, which doubled as a public house, meant enduring constant threats and physical abuse. The Major's fits of anger often escalated to throwing chairs at his servants. However, the Major's preferred method of discipline involved tying them up and subjecting them to brutal whippings in a smokehouse. He would then create a fire from tobacco stems to suffocate and smoke the slaves as further punishment. He called this the Virginia Play. Despite Brown's complaints to his own master about Major Freeland's cruelty, no intervention was made as long as his master continued to receive money from his labor. Desperate to escape the relentless torment, Brown fled into the woods, but was swiftly tracked down by bloodhounds, captured, and returned to Major Freeland. He endured the very punishment he had witnessed time and time again during his stay at the Major's, severe whipping followed by the painful smoking ritual in the smokehouse. After what the Major considered to be sufficient smoking, Brown was untied and immediately set to work again. Number 6. Public burning. Throughout history, punishments inflicted on slaves were often public spectacles intended to instill fear and obedience in other enslaved individuals. These gruesome displays were even attended by neighboring townspeople as a form of entertainment. Among the most horrifying methods of punishment was public burning, where victims were either tied to a stake or hung above a fire. Some died from smoke inhalation before the flames reached them, while others suffered unimaginable burning agony until death finally provided release. One such instance is the tale of a slave named Jerry in 1830. Jerry was burned in an open field with thousands of spectators. The scene included a large pile of pitch pine logs and kindling, where he was chained to a stake. Despite the inhumane circumstances, Jerry reportedly prayed audibly as the flames consumed him. His execution became notorious as the last recorded instance of burning a slave in South Carolina. Why did Jerry get such a harsh punishment, you ask? Well, he was charged with abusing his subcontracted master's wife, which was considered a serious offense. While what he did was definitely wrong, it's important to note that if a white man had done the same thing, he would have gotten a much lighter sentence, and in cases where white men abused enslaved women, there often wasn't even a trial. Jerry's case, although legally justified at the time, highlights the unequal application of justice. A black man like Jerry faced the ultimate punishment for a crime that a white man would have gotten off much easier for. Now, let's talk about branding. This brutal practice involved burning a mark into someone's flesh with a hot metal instrument. During the era of black slavery, large companies often branded their slaves to mark ownership and prevent theft and resale. Ironically, these brands later served as evidence when companies tried to deny the existence of slavery. In Louisiana, the Code Noir even legalized branding as a punishment for runaway slaves. New Orleans, one of the largest slave markets in America in the 19th century, saw countless individualists subjected to this inhumane practice. Branding was especially common in the South, where runaway slaves often had a letter or symbol seared into their face as punishment, making it impossible for them to be assigned to house or servant work again. Why did he get such a harsh punishment, you might wonder? Well, Jerry was charged with abusing his subcontractor's wife, which was considered a serious offense. While there's no excuse for his actions, it's also clear that if he were white, the punishment likely wouldn't have been as severe. In fact, many times, white men who did similar things didn't even face trial. Jerry's case shows how justice was unfairly applied back then, where a black man could face death for something a white man might get a slap on the wrist for. Let's talk about branding. This brutal practice involved burning a symbol onto a person's skin with a hot metal tool. It was mainly used to mark slaves as someone's property during the days of black slavery. Big companies did this to keep their slaves from being stolen or sold off. Ironically, these brands later became proof of what was going on, even when companies denied it was happening. In Louisiana, they even made it legal to brand runaway slaves, and New Orleans was one of the biggest slave markets in America in the 1800s. Countless people suffered because of this. In the South, runaway slaves often had letters or symbols burned onto their faces. This made sure they couldn't get inside work or work in people's houses. An ad in the North Carolina Standard in July 1838 offered a $20 reward for catching a tall black woman. It mentioned she had a burn on her left cheek in the shape of the letter M, proving just how common and cruel branding was. Another newspaper reported that a wealthy man from Street Louis had branded his slave Reuben with the words, "A slave for life." Chains were a common tool of oppression throughout the history of slavery. African captives were shackled together on slave ships, and repeat runaways were often chained to their work or to other slaves. Madame Delphine LaLaurie, a well-known socialite of her time, gained infamy for her brutal treatment of slaves. In 1834, a fire broke out at Madame LaLaurie's mansion. As rescuers tried to put out the fire and ensure everyone's safety, they stumbled upon a horrifying scene inside. Multiple enslaved individuals were discovered in a torturous state, suspended by their necks and their limbs stretched and torn by chains. This shocking discovery incited outrage not only in New Orleans, but across the country. A furious mob gathered and destroyed the mansion's furnishings and property in protest against Madame LaLaurie's atrocities. While historical accounts vary in the exact details and number of victims, the chilling events at Madame LaLaurie's mansion vividly illustrate the extreme cruelty and suffering inflicted through the use of chains on enslaved people. These actions often had devastating outcomes, sometimes leading to death. George Washington, who supported corporal punishment like whipping, also endorsed demotion and sale as methods of discipline. In 1793, Washington instructed his farm manager to demote an enslaved bricklayer named Mucus to farm labor due to concerns about his work ethic. For enslaved individuals moving from domestic or skilled roles to field work, this demotion typically meant harsher conditions, intense labor, and increased risk of violence. In the worst cases, slaves were sold to cruel owners who subjected them to relentless work, which often led to premature death. Washington, as a last resort, would sell enslaved people as punishment for repeated escape attempts. For instance, he sent at least 3 men, Tom, Will, and Jack, to the West Indies, despite previously opposing the practice. Being sold meant permanent separation from loved ones at Mount Vernon, and the brutal conditions and high mortality rates on Caribbean sugar plantations likely amounted to a death sentence for these men. Forced reproduction was another horrific aspect of slavery. Slaves often suffered severe sexual abuse without any legal protections. Pregnant women resulting from such abuse rarely received medical care or compassionate treatment. Instead, they often faced even harsher treatment from their masters' wives. Male slaves were often exploited by their owners, frequently being forced into relationships with various women. After the United States prohibited the importation of slaves in 1808, the South faced a shortage of slaves, causing a booming internal slave market. This led to an increased demand for slaves who could bear children, and individuals were bought and sold based on their reproductive capabilities. As a result, slaves were coerced into reproducing with other slaves to increase their offspring. While some slaves had some choice in selecting their partners, historical records show many instances where slaveholders arranged matches based on physical traits. There were also cases where slaveholders forcibly made female slaves their mistresses and fathered children with them. One infamous example is Thomas Jefferson and Sally Hemings. Sally Hemings, a mixed-race enslaved woman, was owned by Thomas Jefferson, the 3rd president of the United States. Despite having a white father, Sally was born into slavery because her mother was enslaved. This was common under the law, which determined that a child's status followed that of their mother, regardless of the father's race or social standing. Thomas Jefferson had a long-term relationship with Sally Hemings, resulting in several children. Historical records indicate that this relationship began when Sally was a teenager and continued for many years. The power dynamic between Jefferson as her master and Hemings as his slave made it impossible for her to refuse his advances or decisions regarding her reproductive choices. We've just delved into some of the most horrifying punishments inflicted on black slaves during the era of slavery. While it's a painful subject, it's crucial to remember and acknowledge the suffering endured during slavery to ensure such injustices never happen again. By understanding our past, we can continue to value every human life with the dignity and respect it deserves. If this information has resonated with you or affected you in any way, please consider liking and sharing this video to raise awareness. If you have more insights or thoughts to add, feel free to leave a comment below to keep the conversation alive. We encourage you to subscribe to our channel so you can be part of these important discussions. Together, we can honor the past, work towards a better present, and strive to build a more just future for everyone.